to this subject. So you've got a microphone that is right in front of me there, and you've got a roaming microphone. So at any stage, you can go up at the back of the room, and you've got a lectern where you can intervene, ask a question, make a comment, or you can put your hand up and you will have a microphone coming to you. So it is absolutely important that these rules are understood so that you don't feel you're just here to listen and that you have to take on what is being said. Any clarification is going to be brought to you at any point in time. Now, what I would like to do simply is to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. And unlike the other years, they're not going to make comments, they're just going to introduce themselves and give you their background. And after that, I will start. I'm the innocent bystander in the room. I'm going to ask some innocent questions, and then I'm going to let you do your work. So let me start with Gal Hirsch on my right. Brigadier General Gal Hirsch.
Good morning. Morning, can you hear me?
Not yet.
Not yet? Now it's much better. Good morning, ladies, gentlemen. Albert, thanks very much for everything you're doing for the State of Israel and for this dialogue between Australia, United Kingdom, and Israel. This family-like gathering affects a lot, many activities among our nations and families, and it is very, very important. In the end of the day, it is human beings and people that makes difference. I'm actually a soldier since I was 14 years old, served as a military academy cadet, platoon leader, company commander, unit commander, battalion commander, brigade commander, division commander, etc. Still an active reserve general. But the most important rank I've just achieved, just recently, I became grandfather a year ago. Thank you.
And Gal was in charge of the Operation Defensive Shield that Avi Dichter was talking about a second ago. Uri.
You hear me? Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. Uri Halperin. I know Gal from the army. I served in the army for more than 30 years as intelligence officer mainly. Among my positions was I was the Prime Minister Assistant, Intelligence Prime Minister's Assistant. I worked with 2 Prime Ministers in Israel, 2 years with Olmert and 2 years with Netanyahu. After that, I was the Defense Attaché to NATO. And today I'm running my own firm, Istech, Israeli Technology, mainly focused on cybersecurity.
Christopher Pine.
Thank you, Albert. So I'm Christopher Pine. I'm on my 11th dialogue and my 12th visit to Israel, 26 years in the House of Representatives. The most relevant job I've held for this dialogue is I was the most recent Minister for Defence in Australia, and before that Minister for Defence Industry, and held several portfolios over the governments of the Howard, Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison governments. And I'm very pleased to be here to talk about Iran and other things today.
And Professor Boaz Genor.
Thank you, Albert. First of all, it's an honor and a privilege to be once again here at this important dialogue, especially after coming back from a long trip from down there in Australia. I just spent 2 months in Australia. And my claim to fame is to be an old friend of Albert. So that's my first statement. On top of that, I'm the founder and the executive director of the International Policy Institute for Counterterrorism in Israel, the ICT, which is the main hub of know-how practical and theoretical know-how in counterterrorism. We have the privilege to have Gal among one of our fellows. And until recently, I was the Dean of the School of Government at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, and I'm eager to start talking about the subject matter of Iran.
There we go. So let's begin. I mean, there are so many corners that we can start from, but it's impossible perhaps to talk about Iran without talking about terrorism, without talking about Russia, without talking about Syria, the United States. So let's pick one. And what I would like to understand as an innocent bystander is what Avi Dichter said before, is that as long as the Iranians attack targets that don't involve Americans, then they can be assured that the Americans won't retaliate. But they have attacked, in that famous Detroit, they have attacked the United States, and they took out a very important drone, and there was no retaliation. Then they attacked the Saudis, and there was no retaliation, and etc. It seems to me that the Americans have given up on doing anything to Iran, and surely that has emboldened Iran. I would like to understand if that is something that strategically we should be worried about.
Of course, we should be worried about the fact that those attacks were never retaliated properly. It actually brings Iran into understanding that they act according to their ideology in order to protect their Shia superiority in the region, in order to protect their rights, of the economical rights to in the Gulf and in the surrounded areas, and of course it's about the way that they would like to achieve their strategic goals. It's definitely, we can say that the Trump administration that used a lot of, I would say, he delivered a lot of messages without any intention to protect them, made a huge mistake, and it's actually opened the whole arena to that the Iranians would feel from now on much more freely to demonstrate their capabilities.
So you will need to ask for the microphone. Or you can go to the back.
Okay, I'm James Morrison, foreign editor of The Australian. What I haven't heard today, no doubt it's about to come, is the US sanctions have triggered what appears to be a series of quite serious riots in Iran. And on the basis that any change in the Iranian leadership is more likely to come from within, surely that economic arm, the pressure the US is exerting, is it actually working?
Well, James, that's exactly what I was...
And this was a comment by John Lee. Please say your name every time you
James Morrison.
James Morrison, I beg your pardon, James Morrison.
So can I comment on that, Albert, because that was going to be the purpose of my contribution on, in this opening presentations, responding to Albert's rather provocative question, I thought. Because I don't agree with Albert's assessment, and I don't agree with Avi Dichter's view that the United States doesn't retaliate unless there's an attack on the United States' interests, because quite the opposite has been the case. And I think that the Iranians would be extremely unwise to assume anything predictable about the Trump administration's response to any particular crisis. And I think the Iranians would get that because they're quite sophisticated, obviously. They've survived since 1979 in their totalitarian regime successfully, and not because they've been unsophisticated. And I think the point that you raised, James, is a good one, which is that the sanctions that the United States have imposed and that President Trump has doubled down on and then tripled down on have had an enormous impact on the Iraq economy. Inflation is Iran economy. Inflation is now 50% in the economy of Iran. Their production of oil, their export of oil barrels is down to the hundreds of thousands rather than the millions that it used to be. And the economic impact of that is having a dramatic result in civil unrest. And during the so-called Arab Spring of a few years ago, when about 180, 150 Iranians were killed by the Iranian regime, it got world news. But in the last month or so, anything from 180 to 450 people have been killed by the Iranian authorities. And yet they still continue to have civil protests and riots and take control of towns and villages in spite of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's terrible tactics. So I think I won't keep going because this is supposed to be short presentations, but I do think the United States is actually taking quite strong action on Iran. The sanctions are having a serious impact, and I think if they continue to keep going the way they are, they will potentially lead to a regime change in Iran. And I can't see that, well, really, you can comment on that, Richard, if you like. I think that is the best hope of what the Trump administration is trying to do. And I just hope that the Trump administration continues with that policy as opposed to losing heart, because we in the West tend to lose heart when we don't get an immediate response.
May I comment?
Go ahead.
Actually, with all due respect, and I have a lot of respect to Christopher, I have a different view on that matter. And since I think the dialogue should be provocative, I would be provocative. Sanctions are not a goal by themselves. Sanction is a tool to achieve goals. And definitely the sanctions that was imposed by President Trump are effective, no doubt about it. But the question is, what is the goal that they are trying to achieve, and would they be able to achieve the goal? Now, there are two goals that President Trump probably trying to achieve by imposing those sanctions. Either to topple down the regime, or to change the policy of this regime in reference to the nuclear deal, in reference to terrorism, in reference to the rockets and so on and so forth. And I beg to differ with the impact of the sanctions. Yes, it caused a lot of internal problems in Iran. Also, I would add to that the internal problems in Lebanon and Iraq might be a secondary impact of the sanctions, but they are not going to topple down the regime. This regime is ruthless, and this regime is closing the internet and actually butchering the demonstrators wherever they are. And this is not going by itself to achieve the goal. The sanctions should be accompanied with a threat of a military activity. Now, President Trump was saying alongside the sanctions that military activity is not on the table. Now, at the end of the day, the only way to change the policy of Iran is by deterring Iran. And I'm a professor, so let me double click on the generic term of what is a deterrence. A deterrence is when you are able to impose
Boaz,
on the other side your...
If I may ask everyone, we're only having one conversation in this room. Only one conversation. Please respect this. Thank you.
In deterrence, you are setting a red line to the opponent, and you are telling him, if you cross this red line, I will impose an enormous harm on you. The other side needs to be in clear mind and understanding that you are determined to do so, and you have the capability to impose this on him. And when you are coming and saying, but military option is off the table, sanctions by themselves would not achieve the goal of changing the policy of Iran. And I would conclude by saying, not only that military option is not on the table, President Trump was doing every possible mistake on the way trying to achieve this deterrence on Iran, starting with not with calling back the airplanes, the airstrike after toppling down after shooting down the drone, not answering to the terrorist attacks in the Hormuz Straits, not conducting any kinetic activity as a reaction to the attack of Aramco, betraying the Kurds, and Avi Dichter was saying here that yes, we have a different situation with Saudi Arabia. I would dare to predict this is going to change, and Israel will be one of the victims of this wrong American policy. And we might see a deterioration into a war in Israel, mainly because of the outcome of this wrong American policy in the Middle East.
David Swissa. Okay, Michael Eason, that's fine. But you need to get the microphone. Okay, very good. So you stand up. This way I can see you because I'm half blind, as you probably know.
Okay, I was waving, but you could...
No, waving means nothing to me. You have to stand up.
There you are.
You all know my predicament, so
yes,
thank you.
Mita Ramsey from the British delegation. I wanted to ask you something very specific, and it comes out of the civil unrest of today in Iran. And it's the fact that we have a very bad problem that we're very worried about inside the BBC. The BBC World Service and the BBC Persian television has been covering the civil unrest very, very well. Too well for the Iranian regime. And we have at the moment a very serious situation where Iranian workers, correspondents and broadcasters in London are having their families in Iran arrested, called in, their passports taken away, and they're being told to tell their relatives to stop working for the BBC or ... The Director General of the World Service raised this in Berlin very recently, the other week, with the heads of other public broadcasting corporations, including the Australian Director General, to see what we can do to help this. Everybody's very worried, not least, of course, all the Iranian employees of the BBC in London, and it's a serious threat, and it's not receiving publicity, and maybe it should. It's not a secret, it's happening, and pressure needs to be put on the regime. In some ways, it's a compliment to the BBC that it seems to be worried so much about its coverage. But it's not going to be just the BBC and us that are going to get hit by this. So really, we should do something about it now. We've appealed to the UN rapporteurs, but we don't know how long that will take to do anything. I'd like to hear the views from people.
Gal Hirsch.
Well, no doubt that any demonstration and riot in the Palestinian Authority or along the fence with Gaza Strip is strongly covered by all the media resources. But when something is happening in Iran, does not get the same response, let's say, by the international media. This is something about hypocrisy. It's not a new phenomenon for us, unfortunately, but speaking about being a democracy, and we are democracies, it is very, very important that people like us will press on the media to cover such events like is happening in Iran in the same intensive way they cover things around us, for example, just. Now, I'd like to just say a few words regarding our last comment and Albert's provocative question. I'd like just to keep it short and simple. Disengagement policy and withdrawals costs its price. Now take a look of what is happening to us along the last decades. We've made withdrawals and withdrawals and withdrawals here in Israel. We made withdrawal in May 2000 from Lebanon. We've made the disengagement from Gaza Strip. We've made more than disengagement from A zones in what is well known today as the Palestinian Authority, left 7 major cities and many other areas in Judea and Samaria. We are asked always permanently to withdraw more, and under big pressure from the international community to withdraw. What have we got in return for all these withdrawals? And another question, when President Barack Obama made his famous Cairo speech, he made his first visit to the Middle East, as you know, not to Israel, but to Cairo, and made a speech and spoke about disengagement and leaving the Middle East. One of the sparks on these buckets of explosives that caused the well-known Arab Spring or the Middle East upheaval. Actually, what have we got in return for disengagement policy? So when United States of America and its allies does not respond, prefer to disengage and prefer withdrawing policy, it costs prices. And the prices are usually in short term, and then it comes after a few years, because look of the snowball and the chain reaction of disengagement policy made by Obama's administration more than a decade ago. Look what is happening after even this administration in United States is not responding to the Iranian policy. And finally, it is all a matter of the way we treat time. We, Israelis, Australians, Great Britain, Americans, we are Westerniers. The Iranians behave like nomads. The way that they treat time is completely different than us. They have time. The time actually is for them, it doesn't matter when Quds Force, as the main power of the Revolutionary Guard and the Ayatollah's regime, when Quds Force will be that successful in destroying Israel and change Dar el-Harb into Dar el-Islam, which means actually that all the world will be Islamist radicalists. Actually, they have patience. We must educate ourselves and the next generation to be patient.
Michael Kroger, it's been standing there for a while.
Thank you. Yeah, you asked what Israel got into
We need the microphone to work at the end there.
my question, Albert, is to Christopher Pine. Christopher, back in 2015, the then Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop announced that the Australian government would be sharing intelligence with the Iranian government in relation to ISIS, which was the first time that I'd ever remembered or heard of a Western government sharing intelligence with Iran post the revolution. Do we know if any intelligence was shared between the Iranian government and the Australian government, what the quality of that intelligence was? And are we still sharing intelligence with our friends in the Iranian government? Are they passing on our intelligence to any of their friends? Are we passing vice versa? What was the nature, do you know, of this cooperation between these two close nations?
Thank you, Michael. I assume you've switched to the Labor Party, have you? That question could have come from Kimberley Kitching to me, or from Richard Marles or Marsha Thompson. Well, I have to say honestly that I'm not aware of the sharing of any intelligence between Australia and Iran over ISIS or any other matter in my time in the government. And there are other members of the government and the former government who are here, of course, who might have a view about that as well. The only thing that I can imagine that we would have ever shared with the Iranians or sought their advice about would have been potentially around people smuggling. And of course that was the Abbott government that managed to stop the people smuggling trade, and that might have been the reason at the time we had discussions with the Iranians around who was being sent from Iran potentially. But I'm not aware of any, but if Julie Bishop said that was the case, and John Lee, in fact, of course, is here as well, who used to work for Julie Bishop, he might have a view on that as well. But if Julie Bishop said it's true, then it must be, but I'm not aware of it myself. I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on that, or even the current Attorney General.
And did you object? As a cabinet minister, did you object to her sharing any information?
That's a very good question. Thank you. Thank you, Albert. This is so glad I agreed to do the panel. I don't remember objecting at the time, but I'm a team player, of course, so I would have spoken behind closed doors to my colleagues.
Thank you, Christopher. So there is another subject that we need. Oh, Mr. Abbott, Prime Minister Abbott.
Thanks, Albert. Look, my recollection, and it's pretty hazy because there's been a lot of dirty water under the bridge since then, but my recollection is that the observation, and I don't recall the phrase intelligence sharing, but I do remember that this was at the time when Australia was putting a substantial training team into the Taji military base to train the Iraqi army for more effective operations against the Daesh death cult. And there was some concern that elements of the